Hello, everyone. You're all very welcome to this week's Inspiring Ideas at Trinity webinar. My name is Megan Donaldson, and I'm the Global Alumni Relations Officer here at Trinity Development and Alumni. Today, we're delighted to welcome Christine Casey, Professor in the History of Art and Architecture here at Trinity, and Yvonne Farrell, co-founder of the award-winning architecture firm Grafton Architects. They'll be looking at how pandemics have impacted on historic buildings and will share their vision for how our built landscape, from Trinity's own campus to Dublin's city centre and beyond, may change to adapt to the challenges posed by COVID-19. Before we start, I'd just like to go over quickly a few technical items. If you're joining us on Zoom and you'd like to view in full screen, you can do so using the button in the top right-hand corner. If you need to adjust your audio settings, you can do so using the button in the bottom left corner. And if you need to leave the session, you can do so using the button in the bottom right-hand corner. We very much encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentations, and you can do that by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and our speakers will respond to the questions later in the webinar. If you experience any technical issues during this webinar, or if you need to drop off at any time, we'll be recording it so that you can watch it at a later time. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube Live, if you need to mute or unmute the video, you can do so using the small speaker button circled here in red. To share the webinar, click on the share link on the right, and to subscribe to our YouTube channel, you can click on the red button. As I said, we'd love to hear from you, so please do share your thoughts and questions in the comments box, and these will be relayed to the speakers. The presentations will take about 30 minutes, and they'll be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A and discussion. So we should take just under an hour, and we should finish up around 2 p.m. Irish time. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Christine Casey is a professor in architectural history at Trinity College, Dublin, and leads an Irish Research Council Advanced Laureate Research project called Craft Value, which focuses on craftsmanship in 18th century architecture. She has published widely on architecture and decoration, including the definitive reference work on Dublin City called Dublin, which was published by Yale University Press. A member of the Royal Irish Academy and an honorary member of the Royal Institute of the Architects of Ireland, she has served on national organizations for architectural heritage and has held numerous international research fellowships. She's also been elected Parnell Fellow at Magdalen College, Cambridge for the 2020-2021 academic year. Our other speaker, Yvonne Farrell, is the co-founder of Grafton Architects, which won the World Building of the Year award in 2008 for their Bocconi University building in Milan. The practice won the inaugural RIBA International Prize in 2016 for their UTEC building in Lima, Peru, and was also awarded the 2020 RIBA Royal Gold Medal. Yvonne, along with Grafton co-founder Shelley McNamara, was appointed as curator of the 16th Venice Biennale of Architecture in 2018. Yvonne and Shelley won the Pritzker Architecture Prize in 2020, which is considered the highest honor in the architectural profession, and they also received honorary doctorates from Trinity College Dublin in 2019. Now I'd like to welcome our very first speaker, Professor Christine Casey.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with Yvonne and Megan and Alex and alumni, and I hope there are some familiar faces out there. When I was first asked to contribute to a webinar on COVID-19 and architecture, I must admit I was initially bemused, and I wondered what an historian of architecture in the early modern period might have to say about the present. So I decided to look at the buildings of the past and to see if they can actually say anything about the present. It also made me think about the way we view the architecture of the past and to wonder about the impact of the pandemic on the way we actually look into the past. And it also made me think about a specific building known to you all in Trinity College. It's at the centre of the life of the college, and I will conclude with that building. So in looking at the past, my initial sense was that hospitals would surely tell us about the buildings of the past, about the plague, rather, in the early modern period. And I was actually surprised, with admittedly limited resources, to find that plague didn't loom very large in the literature. And in fact, Nicholas Pevsner was able to write a typological account of European hospitals with only passing mention of plague. So the form of plague hospitals seems to have been closely related to other hospital types, but with a number of distinctions. And behind me here, you see the Ospedale degli Innocenti in Florence by Brunelleschi, begun in 1419. And like so many hospitals of the later Middle Ages and the early modern period, this hospital was built around an arcaded courtyard. And you see this wonderful arcade across the front of the building. So the key factors of hospital buildings at this period seem to have been scale, to have rooms as large as possible. Air was hugely important, so ventilation, and they understood that air rising up into, in some cases, great domes at the crossing of cruciform hospitals was immensely important. Alberti, actually writing in the 15th century, in 1450, says to us about hospitals, particularly for plague, those with contagious diseases should be kept well away, not only from the city, but also from the public road. And this is a direction that was reiterated as late as 1900 in the British Medical Journal, which urged that plague hospitals should be separate and, importantly, should be temporary structures. So precursors of the kinds of hospitals that we have seen, such as the Nightingale hospitals in Britain. Alberti was writing at a time when hospitals proliferated in Florence. They were built by the city guilds, and there was a communal, charitable investment in hospitals. Now, this was spurred by the Black Death, which from 1349 to 1352 raged throughout Europe, and definitely had an impact on the patronage by guilds, by communities in hospital architecture. So it is arguable that without the impact of the Black Death, we wouldn't have, for example, this amazing building, which shows us the introduction of all'antica classicism into European architecture. A city which was particularly susceptible to plague was Venice. And when I took this photograph from the Tower of San Giorgio 3 years ago, it was really, what it spoke to me of was mass tourism. You see this giant cruise ship berthed there to the rear of the historic buildings. But in the light of recent events, this ship brings us back to the quarantine ships which lay in the Venetian lagoon in the 16th and 17th centuries. And in fact, the term quarantine comes from 40 giorni, 40 days, because the Venetians imposed 40 days of isolation on ships arriving into the city at times of plague. They also built hospitals for plague victims away from the core of the city. So very far from San Marco and the Doge's Palace, on islands in the lagoon. And these were known as lazzaretti, lazzaretto, coming from the name Lazarus, who was believed to have been raised from the dead by Jesus. And in fact, in Dublin, we had a Lazar's Hill or Lazar's Hill, where there was a hospital for lepers. And this was on Townsend Street, and known as Lazar's Hill, later became known as Lazy Hill. And the hospital was actually run by the Augustinians of All Hallows, which of course would become Trinity College. So these lazzaretti in the lagoon functioned as quarantine centres. They were also used for the disinfection of goods. And of course, they were used for the care of plague victims and for the burial of victims of plague. But it's not the practical buildings, the hospitals of Venice, which actually are the enduring legacy of this period in the city's history, but rather the aspirational buildings. In fact, two amazing churches, one of which you see here, the Redentore, or the Redeemer or Saviour, which was commissioned by the Venetian government in supplication for deliverance from plague and thanksgiving for deliverance from a plague of 1575 to 1577. The church was designed by Andrea Palladio. You can see its wonderful pedimented stone front, which faces onto the Giudecca Canal. And now this plague wiped out almost a third of the population of the city of Venice. And every year, the Doge and the Senate would process to the Redentore to give thanks for deliverance and to remember those who had died during the plague. And you see this wonderful painting here showing that pontoon bridge, which is still built every year by the engineering corps of the Italian army. Every year on the 3rd Sunday of July, so watch this space, the 13th of July, I don't know what, I doubt it will happen this year, although there may be some type of ritual celebration. And in fact, the person who gave me this or brought this picture to my attention is a man called Philip Kotler. He's a specialist on Venetian painting, who arrived at the age of 22 in the city of Venice on the day that this celebration or festa was taking place. Very short quotation, but it's important to what I want to say. He says, "The Festa del Redentore was my first experience of Venice and the reason I fell completely in love with the city. I landed at Zattere by boat as part of the first few steps I took in Venice and was immediately, literally swept up in the crowd flowing over towards the Redentore. The main doors open, the candles blazing in the sunset, choir going, the works. I've never been the same since." So the memory of that terrible event preserved in that church and preserved in the ritual is still very much a part of the culture of Venice. And of course, the other great church, which I'll just mention very briefly, is the Salute, Santa Maria della Salute, Salute meaning health and well-being, which is that great structure which terminates the Grand Canal. Now, the plague, which actually stimulated the Salute, is yet another plague less than 40 years after the one which brought about the Redentore. And that was the plague which swept through Italy from 1629 to 1632. And Rome lived in fear of the plague spreading to the city. And here you see the governmental buildings of Rome, designed by Michelangelo on the Capitoline Hill, new buildings at this time in 1629. And the Romans put in place a series of measures not very different to our own. And they, for example, they established a health board, the Sanità. They put ropes across the Tiber to prevent ships coming in. You had to have a certificate of health to enter the city, and they stopped trading with infected cities. And they also put onto the ancient walls and gateways a guard manned by the guilds, which effectively protected the city. So you can imagine Rome at this point at curfew, looking not dissimilar to what we've seen in the past months. And I'm showing you here a remarkable image taken by Raymond Keaveney, who was in Rome during lockdown and took a series of amazing images in which we see the monuments, streets, squares devoid of human activity. And this is what made me think about the way we view history. because of course buildings are containers of human activity, and yet historians, critics go to amazing ends to achieve photographs with nobody in them, a sort of neutron bomb approach to architectural photography, when of course buildings are so much a part of what we are. And this brings me to my last image and to that building in Trinity College, the examination hall, which you all know so well, which is used for commencements where degrees are conferred. I was at a virtual commencement ceremony just a week or so ago. Wonderful experience in terms of seeing the family of my student in their home on Zoom, and the whole extended family being able to participate. So there are positives, but of course we missed this great room, the impact, the tangible impact of this room, the strength of the rusticated walls, the celebratory ornament, the great windows, the murmur of the students, the excitement of the students and their families, the music, the anticipation of the procession. Alberti said in the 15th century, buildings are dignified by use. And of course, our lives are dignified by architecture. So I would not want to extrapolate too much out of the present situation, in the hope that, like our forebears, we will, after a period of prudence, be able again to enjoy these buildings to the full. Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you very much, Christine. And I would like to welcome Yvonne Farrell, our second speaker. Yvonne, fire away.
Okay, am I on?
You are, and we can see your images.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to participate in this. When Thomas Jefferson lived in Paris in between 1778 and 1785 as American ambassador, there was a debate and an architectural competition for new hospitals. The proposed hospitals were dealing with the up-to-date issues of medical science at that time, which included obviously well-being and the protection from infection. The winning plans for 4 alternative hospitals proposed centralized lawns surrounded by pavilions connected by covered colonnades. And although the hospitals were never built, it is believed that they stayed in Jefferson's mind and influenced the layout of the academic village, the University of Virginia in Charlottesville in the USA. The Pulitzer Prize-winning architecture critic George Goldberg describes Jefferson's campus as, and I quote, an essay in balance between the built world and the natural one. The space of the lawn really is a room with the sky as its ceiling. I'll just move on to the next one. Sorry, I'm not able to move to the next slide for some reason. What do I do?
If you just press the forward button, Yvonne, or click on it, it should move.
Yeah, no, I'm doing that. It's not stop share. No, I'm sharing, aren't I?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, and I'm pressing forward and back and nothing. Okay, so what do I do? Do I stop share or something? Okay, here we go. We have it. Thank you. These are 4 plans, which I'll talk about in a minute, but I just want to start by saying that the future, the question about what we do in the future, that we'd like to say that the future is continuous present, and that it's also an issue of common sense about what lasts. And the issue of dimension, we're all very aware of the 2 meters or what 2 meters is. And just today, it's just interesting that the World Health Organization have said that they will study fresh evidence that airborne transmission of coronavirus is now, according to a group of international scientists, that they have concluded that the virus spreads far beyond 2 meters, and that they're saying that the infected person, when they exhale, they expel droplets, but droplets under 5 micrometers in size can become suspended in the air for several hours and can travel up to tens of meters. This is what the scientists are saying, and the World Health Organization, they are actually going to look at this evidence in detail. And what's interesting about that is really that dimension and distance is something that as architects that we deal with. This is part of our common trade, if you like. And in the third plan here, which is a plan familiar to all of Trinity, you have the long room here, and I've turned it in this direction because this is my normal route from home to the office, right through Front Square, out through the main gates. And what is really beautiful about the courtyards of Trinity College is that buildings actually hold, in the same way like in Jefferson's Lawn in Charlottesville, that you have these great rooms where the sky is the ceiling. But in this case here, what we're doing in our office, we're looking at dimension. This is roughly 200 meters from here to here. And we were doing a competition for Saclay in Paris, and the site was 200 meters by 100 meters. And we were looking at buildings. This wonderful building to the left-hand side of Trinity is Ospedale Maggiore, which was built in Milan in 1456 by the Duke of Milan, Francesco Sforza, and built as a hospital for the poor. It stayed as a hospital until the 20th century, and is now continues as a building in use as a department of University of Law. But what is amazing, I can't go into it today, but to look at that building in detail, the level of dealing with fresh air, the items that Christine has referred to as well, fresh air and sunshine. And if we move to the project in Saclay, what was really interesting, it's a distance from the center of Paris on a plateau in Saclay. We were dealing with hundreds of offices, and part of the master plan was that 100 trees were to be incorporated into whatever the winning design would be. And what we, looking at these amazing courtyards historically, worked our proposition that we had a series of courtyards around which the offices and research offices and spaces were organized. And in terms of this plan, the north is to the top of the page. You enter into the first courtyard, you view through into the larger one, which is the trees in real ground, and a series of other courtyards, which are representing the seasons, and pinwheel around a central space from the entrance. And for us, in terms of the section in the bottom of the drawing, you enter into the building, you move up this, if you like an internal courtyard, which is top lit, you move up various stairs or a ramp that brings you to a library, which is like a bridge position between the internal space and the courtyard formed by these natural trees, which are embedded in real ground below where the car parking is in the rest of the building. And this image up here on the right, you're on the staircase in that space. You can see in the distance the ramp bringing you to the library in the distance and viewing out to the garden. And these trees, which are really an act of faith in the future as well, that these trees positioned in the central courtyard. And this image for us is really important, that the individual office, going back to the points that Christine has made as well, that each of the offices, whether it's 3 windows or 2 windows, each office has a window either into a courtyard or out into the surrounding landscape, has tall ceiling, has natural ventilation. And the thin plan, which allows both pleasure of light, is also something to do with relationship with nature. On the right-hand side, we have the deep wall, which screens from the sun and also allows connections both to courtyards and to outside. we have had the pleasure of building in the beautiful city of Toulouse in France. This incredibly organic brick city has many, many beauties. And one of the important aspects of that city are these courtyards. So this image in the top of the screen is one of the many courtyards in Toulouse. And when we were making the proposition for this university research building, that the proposition we made was that can we make a 21st century courtyard where natural air breathes into the building? And this is the completed building. In the plan on the left-hand side, you arrive from a space of the city, you ramp up just over 600 millimeter into a central space in this building, which is a 21st century courtyard. On the image on the right-hand side, you have ramped up into the space, and this area here holds the community of scholars together, but allows the breeze and the ventilation and the, if you like, the breeze coming in from the Canal de Brienne, which is on the left-hand side, to move up and be part of the community of scholars. So each of the research professors have their own offices, each office with a view out to the extraordinary views and cultural heritage of the city of Toulouse, but also they cluster around this space, which allows the natural air to move through the building. So here you have that central space, this void with sky above, and the section showing the sky cloister, which frames the entrance and brings you through the building. So this is the sky cloister, which allows external circulation to be part of the pleasure of this building. And here we have a view looking back out of the city where the external connection and circulation frames the entrance. So in terms of the point I'm making is that in terms of making contemporary buildings, that the question of air conditioning, of deep plates, of narrow plan, each of these bars of offices are under 12 meters deep. So it means you have cross ventilation and natural light. This sketch drawing is really describing a project we built in Milan for Bocconi University. And this required 1,000 offices and large scale rooms for seminars below. And what we did was we elevated a series of courtyards framing the sky. So this section is, if you like, theoretically the offices with the sunlight coming through, and these smaller courtyards allowing air to flow freely from the city floor to the sky, and also benefiting from shade. And one of the things in terms of natural convection, you have it's like the up and down sash window, which is an amazing, at least simple but effective element in buildings here in Dublin, where you get cold air on the lower level, you get shadow and you get hot air, and you get movement. So here we have a study model of the building showing the courtyards with the light, and then you have a section describing the courtyards between the offices, natural light, even coming into the big room for 1,000 people. You see it here in section. And also in terms of volume. I mean, Christine, it's interesting. She talked about scale, large scale, and air and ventilation in her historic description of architecture. In moving down to, this is a project we built in Lima in Peru. Lima is a desert city, 12 degrees down from the equator, and should be unbelievably hot. But because of a current coming from Antarctica, the temperature is affected and roughly in the 20 degrees Celsius. And when we were doing this competition, we asked the question, if you have a place where the temperature is normally static around 20s, does that affect architecture? And we questioned and questioned the brief and interrogated and separated out the rooms that needed to be inside to other things that could be exterior. And this image describes then the circulation. What we did was we said we would make a vertical campus where the students would circulate always on the outside, where they would have the pleasure of seeing what other departments are doing by virtue of the being able to see in, but also that we would weave landscape into this matrix of circulation. And it means that the breeze from the ocean actually participates in this carved mountain. I'd like to talk about, if you like, the impact of COVID. It confined us to home. It's asked us to readjust our lives. And now it's a real chance to rethink how we live. And it was referred to in the beginning of the introduction. In 2018, Shelley McNamara and I were curators of the Venice Biennale. And we invited about 100 architects from around the world to present their work to the general public. And today I'd just like to remind ourselves really about two particular projects. One is a school and the other is housing. And the amazing thing, there's no time today to do it, but if you have time to go into YouTube and look at this kindergarten in Tokyo, it's by Tezuka Architects, and it's absolutely wonderful. It's an oval in plan, it's playful, but it's deadly serious. It integrates landscape. And just have a look at the YouTube of children playing and jumping and the continuous running because it's an oval. But the serious section, I think, is amazing here on the left-hand side. What it does, and as we witness all our children being, away from school because of COVID at the moment, and the adjustments that schools are trying to make at the moment, if you look here, that there are sliding screens between inside and outside. The children are up here on the roof. They're able to modify the plan on the interior. And this, in terms of housing, this is a fantastic housing scheme by Tali Architecture and Design in Helsinki. And it was built in 2011. And the reason for putting it here today, to put it in your minds, is that this was a block of flats of 39 flats. And the basic idea was that residents would be given the absolute minimum so that they can customize their needs over time. And it was done in two ways. There was a frame first designed and built by the architect and developer. And then the inhabitants came in a kind of a DIY sense to modify their homes over time. There were two types of sizes, 50 square meters and 102. But the main thing is that it was 5 meters high. So you can see in the section of this kind of neutral shell. So this is 2.5 meters and another 2.5. So you get a 5 meter volume with south facing windows. So it means that you can arrive in, have it as a studio yourself, or modify it into a 3-bedroom house if that's the way your life goes, but also you can modify it. So it's really important, I think, to really think about the possibility of change, to talk about adaptability, flexibility, and versatility. In terms of COVID, there are things that we also need to see on the impact, the positive impact on the earth. This in terms of air quality, about how when we change our lives in one direction, the impact that it has on air quality. But there's also the issue of nature and that we are creatures of the earth. That it also, in terms of the last 3 months or so, it has changed our relationship with the time of day, with the seasons, with the value of the sea, and seeing how the sea refreshes the sand each time the tide, and also the beauty of the sky. It also is about slowing down and hearing nature. I think people sometimes thought the birds were singing louder during our lockdown than before, but we do believe that it's more one of time and observing. And I'd like to finish with this image, which is first of all, quoting a Mexican architect, Luis Barragan, and he spoke about a teacher of his who reminded him to learn again, and reminding him to see with innocence. And this image, which I'll finish on, is of a fallen tulip leaf, which is a beauty that perhaps we had forgotten to notice. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina and Yvonne. Those are both incredible presentations and gave us a lot of things to discuss here, and which I think we can see because we've got quite a number of questions coming in. So what I'd like to do is actually start off with one, Yvonne, that speaks to something you sort of wound up on there, and maybe the apartment in Helsinki where you were talking about versatility of a living space. And we have a question from alumnus Romney Keane, who's asking, in the light of the very high infection rate of COVID-19, do you think the last government's proposal for the architecture of communal living should be abandoned?
My immediate reaction is yes. I think that I think that we have to be very careful about the swings and kind of roundabouts of pressure. I mean, housing is a critical issue. It is something that is really very important and does need to be tackled. But in the point of the Helsinki sample that I showed you, that it's not about making the minimum. It's really that living should be the maximum possible, and that it's about invention and about versatility. And in that case, in Helsinki, or in answer to the question, I think that there are short-term problems, but you don't want to build problems. You want to actually build future solutions, and that a tall ceiling, a good window, having a proper dimension. It's just very interesting. Distance and dimension are something that we all are now knowing in very physical ways. So my short answer is yes, it should be scrapped, and the future should be about making the best and most efficient and flexible housing solutions as possible.
Thank you. I think that actually speaks to another question that's just come up, a bit related, from Charles Duggan, who asked maybe, Yvonne, if you could comment on the future of the numerous student housing complexes built in Dublin in recent years and their potential for adaptability, or maybe we're going down the wrong avenue for their redundancy in the COVID era.
I think we have to be very careful about the relationship between kind of money's available, taxes available, get it done, and we solve this problem. The problem is not so functionally related. The point I was making about, say, the Ospedale Maggiore, which was a hospital from the 1400s and is now a university building, that it's, in terms of sustainability, that building still works as a building. If things are done correctly, if we have a generosity, not just of spirit, but a generosity of space, that, I mean, if you look at the rooms within Trinity, they are just really beautiful rooms, tall ceilings, tall windows. They still have an elegance. Really, what we should be doing is giving rather than minimizing what we give, to maximize flexibility allows for change. You are never 100% sure, but the more elegant and the more you give in terms of dimension, the more likely it is sustainable in the long term.
So it's really bringing us back to basic principles. If you can get A, B, and C right in terms of space and light, you're starting off in the best place. Which speaks, I think you mentioned there the hospitals, which brings us back to Christine a little bit. And there's actually a question, Christine, that's come in to you from Lisa Godson, who said, thank you very much for the talk, it was superb. And she wondered if you might say something about, firstly, how plague impacted on the use of space, in terms of how people might have had to retreat from shared space on occasions in the past. And secondly, if there was, during historic plagues, there's a specific impact on proportion and scale in terms of, we're so familiar with stay 2 meters away from people. Was that something that might have been implemented back then, and how that impacted on ergonomics, et cetera? So Christine, maybe if you could field that one.
Okay, well, hello, Lisa. I have limited information on the actual I suppose, urban grain at that time. I mean, the cities remained very dense in the early modern period. So curfew, the problem was that they did not understand how the illness was, how the virus was passed. I mean, they just didn't understand that. What they thought, for example, in the 17th century, well, they weren't wrong in a certain sense, but they didn't understand the origin of it. They thought that it was a miasma of poisonous atoms in the air, that actually this was the problem. They didn't see it as being, and they knew that they had to isolate, and they knew that people could pass it from one to another once infected, but they didn't understand the source. I mean, separation, curfew, all of that, but nothing like, I mean, for example, in Rome, I mean, this is the amazing thing, that Rome managed to protect itself against the plague in that period. But that didn't mean that they curtailed their activities in terms of communal activities. For example, they had a gigantic procession in 1630 in supplication for deliverance from plague, when there were hundreds of thousands of people marched through the city of Rome. You know, and the same just at the end when they felt that they had passed through it. So, I mean, fortunately, we have a sense of this distance because of what science tells us. All they understood was that you isolate the people who had the symptoms and remove them from the city and hope for the best. But they didn't have the grasp that we have of distancing.
Thank you, Christine. I think they were on the right track, but they didn't know why. We know why we're doing what we're doing, which makes it a little bit easier these days for us in terms of isolation. There's actually two questions here that are quite similar to one another, and I think maybe Yvonne, you could chime in, and then Christine, if you have anything, follow in. Graham Hickey is asking a question about our settlement patterns. He's saying that we have here in Ireland an inherently dispersed settlement pattern, and whether it's one-off housing or housing estates, both largely suburban in outlook and physicality. And he would like to know if you think that the pandemic has presented possibly a nail in the coffin for urban living in Ireland, particularly the provincial towns, or do you think that increased home working can provide an opportunity for people to see the benefits of greater interaction with quality, accessible urban environments right on their doorstep? And that also goes along with a question from Maeve Hand, who is wondering if remote working could have been a positive overall experience, what impact that could have for city centres and the adaptability of commercial properties. So I think they're quite similar.
I think that the interesting and wonderful thing about complexity and density and city living is that you can walk to a shop, you can walk to various places. I think that that I don't think it's the death knell of a city that we have to, you know, be fearful of other people. I think that this will pass, like what Christine is saying, that they have come and gone. I mean, we certainly, maybe some people expected that pandemics would happen kind of regularly, but certainly we didn't, certainly I wasn't sitting waiting for a pandemic to happen. I think that cities, what is amazing about cities is that, and how we build future cities, is that I think what it will ask us to do is to have a relationship with nature. And is it a small balcony, or is it the garden, or is it the shared park? That it's really that image that I had of, say, a Sandymount Beach, when the tide goes out, you realize that within an urban situation that you have this incredible plaza of natural benefit and sky that's really enriching. I don't think I am more of a supporter of the city as the greatest human invention, and that we should weave into existing structures and make them more beautiful, rather than this being a kind of run to the hills and we'll have a cabin and we'll avoid each other. That architecture has the capacity to enrich the overlap of people's lives, done properly. It also has the capacity, building has the capacity to make life terrible. So it's really the aspiration to make the best possible interreaction, to have dimension, to be able to be aware of other people, but also to form like, it's interesting, the size of footpaths. You see, even here near the Dodder, there's a narrow one and there's a wide one. The wide one is safer at the moment because you can be 2 meters from other people. The other one is a little bit tight. So people are my answer to the question is a great belief in city, a great belief in the possibility of making a place of civilization and of pleasure and of culture. And it isn't a matter of suburbanization.
Thank you, Yvonne. Christine, would you like to add anything, or?
I agree. I mean, I listened to the Institute of Historic Building Conservation. They had a a virtual school a couple of weeks ago, and the issue that was raised in one of the questions about remote working came up, and several of the speakers spoke to it. And the hope was that because people could hopefully stay in their own place, in their own town or village, that there would be a sort of renaissance, if you like, in the provincial towns and villages, and that you might see a regeneration happening within those towns because people could actually identify with them, and therefore communal space would be improved. The problem, of course, remains the convenience and the shopping centres. And my hope is that, you know, the experience of being out in the air, what we've seen in Germany, the small shops on the streets being opened first, the shopping centres being opened last, that, you know, possibly this might help towards regeneration of the town centres. But of course, we'll all have to stop getting into our cars and going to the supermarket, you know, to try and make that happen.
Thanks, Christine. One of the things that you both mentioned in previous answers was just about the shape and the size of buildings. And of course, in Dublin, we tend to have a limit on how high we can build our buildings. And Catherine Henry was wondering if in the future we'll see more tall buildings with natural airflow rather than smaller buildings with closed windows and air conditioning.
I think that...
what do you think?
I don't think it's a matter of necessarily form. I think that sometimes high buildings work extremely well. I know there's a big debate about the Bosco Verticale in terms of Milan and landscape embedded in tall buildings. I think that it isn't a matter of kind of low buildings that are dark and dingy and tall buildings which are you know, glorious and far views. I think that there's a huge amount of possible invention. There's a huge amount of historic precedents that we can work from. It's just interesting. I live in a little square, and what's interesting is that you find that with just grass and trees, a bit like what Olmsted uses in many of the projects in the United States, that very simple things allowed children to still climb trees. And I was shocked recently at seeing the percentage of children in Ireland that have climbed trees is kind of down to kind of 1% or something. And it's because, you know, it's dangerous, or they don't go up, or they're not allowed, or the insurance doesn't allow them to do it. But it is, what I found amazing is that building is not a matter of tall or low. There are varieties of choice. There are many, many talented architects in this country that can make spaces where the community of dwellers can find pleasure both in their own individual places and also in the collective. I mean, that's what the power of housing is, that you can actually make something where a community is formed by the pleasure of the buildings, as opposed to the building being kind of an isolated tower.
I love the idea of more children climbing trees. That certainly, it's a lovely image, and I think you're completely right. It's not just about the building itself; it's about the community that it engenders. Which brings us to, I think we have time for one more question. That brings me to our last question. This comes from Sandra O'Connell, and she thanks you both for a wonderful and thought-provoking lecture, and would like to know, following on from your comment, Yvonne, that COVID is a real chance to reinvent how we live. What changes would you both like to see in our cities and towns? Do we need more public space? And if so, what kind?
You want to take it, Christine?
Yeah. Well, I would certainly, I mean, I'm a provincial person, and I lament the demise of the towns. I look at Drogheda and Dundalk, and I just wish that we could fill those shops on the town streets, that we could get back the kind of communal life that you saw, you know, even decades ago. So I think that we need to invest in the conservation of the old buildings that form those streets. And we need to obviously find economic ways of making them viable. But I do think that the whole issue of the shopping centre versus the town street is something that has to be managed and given serious thought. I also think that if we could have more living over the shop in these town centres, that would be a great improvement. So yes, investment in public space and in pedestrianised space would be really desirable.
Yes, if I could add, I think the last number of months has also kind of queried how much we need to consume. I mean, do you need to open the boot of your car and fill it with stuff, you know, at regular times, huge amounts of stuff? Or is there a way of being able to be less consumer orientated, that you can walk to, that you can appreciate distance? That I think what we have learned, sorry, it's slightly off, Sandra, thank you for your question, but what we have certainly learned, and I think that what Christine described in that hall behind you there, that it kind of longs for people, that even though technology can make us communicate as we're doing now, even though we can hopefully survive this pandemic, and it's terrible the amount of people who are not surviving, and we really, you know, it's a real issue, but dimension and enclosure, and that architecture has the capacity to enrich people's lives, like you're saying, in town centres, to walk to. I mean, I come from Tullamore, and Tullamore has beautiful squares and beautiful streets, and it would be amazing to have more people living in the town centre. There are people moving back in, which is interesting, and it will change, I think, because people have had to spend more time where they live than ever before. In the last 3 months, I think people, in the kind of general lockdown, people have seen the value and the strengths and the shortcomings of where they live. And versatility, distance, and neighborliness are probably values that, I mean, kindness was one of the most amazing things, I think, that was generally as a country, that neighbors really watched out for one another. And I think in terms of how things will change, I think we have to value that what we do should be versatile, should be of the highest quality, and that we should both invent and look to the past.
I was on mute. Thank you both so much. This has been an absolutely incredible afternoon. I think this has truly been an inspiring webinar, and certainly a thought-provoking one, giving us all a lot to consider, especially in terms, I think the buzzwords today are definitely flexibility, adaptability, and potentially airflow. So thank you very much. I just thank you both for joining us today, but from your respective homes. I know you're both very busy, so we all appreciate it. I'd also like to thank the team here at Trinity Development and Alumni for all the work they put into making this series happen. And finally, I'd like to thank all our viewers for joining us today and for all your incredibly engaging questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to them. There was so many, but thank you for sending them in. I'd just like to wrap up with a few small things before we go. So bear with me one moment. So we are moving to a new schedule for the webinar series. We'll be holding them every second Wednesday from now on. So I hope you'll join us for the one in 2 weeks from today. It's on Wednesday, the 22nd of July. The next webinar is called Networking and Career Transition in a Post-COVID World, and the speaker is networking expert and Trinity graduate Kingsley Aikens. If you enjoyed today's webinar and would like more information on the topic discussed today, you'll find links to a few interesting websites there at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to discover a little bit more about the Craft Value project that Christine is leading on, you can visit www.craftvalue.org. The project focuses on craftsmanship in the 18th century and is funded by the Irish Research Council. And the project is also on Twitter with the handle @craftvalue_TCD and on Instagram as Craft Value, all one word. If you'd like to see more about the buildings that Yvonne discussed today, that her firm has worked on. And if you have any questions about them, you'll find information about the practice at www.graftonarchitects.ie. And you can also connect with them on Twitter at Grafton Arcs. And finally, if you have any questions and comments regarding this webinar series or any other questions you'd like to ask of us here in Trinity Development Alumni, you can email us at alumni@tcd.ie. As I mentioned, our next webinar will be Wednesday, the 22nd of July. The registration link will be sent out by email next week, so or the following week. So do keep an eye on your inboxes. And in the meantime, thank you once again for joining us and stay safe.